See everyone, my name is Foreman Gray, and I am with the Cherokee Nation. I'm a Cherokee Nation citizen, and I'm also a History and Preservation Officer with the tribe. Today we're going to talk about the Trail of Tears. I'm sure a lot of you all have heard about the Trail of Tears, and today we're going to talk a little bit about what led up to the Trail of Tears. A lot of people don't understand that it was a very divisive issue that came to be with our tribe and some of our members, so we're going to go into that a little bit about what happened before the Trail of Tears, and then we'll discuss that, the removal, a little bit more as well. What is the Trail of Tears? The Trail of Tears is, today we're going to focus on the Cherokee Trail of Tears, but just about every Native American tribe had some type of forced removal. The Cherokee removal happened in 1838 and 1839. We actually, last year, just commemorated the 175th anniversary of the final detachment that arrived in Indian Territory March 25th of 1839. And as I mentioned, what tribes were affected, just about every Native tribe across the United States had some type of forced removal from their ancestral homelands. Where I'm from, Keetoowah, Oklahoma, we currently have, I believe, 39 federally recognized tribes that are in the state of Oklahoma today. So there's more tribes there, I believe, than any other state in the United States. And this down here, this photo is a picture of the Trail of Tears exhibit that's at the Cherokee Heritage Center there in Park Hill, Oklahoma, which is just outside of Tahlequah. This right here is original Cherokee Territory, comprised of states of Kentucky, parts of West Virginia, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina. The original Cherokee Territory had approximately 81 million acres. The towns were communal and autonomous towns and villages, and each had their own chief. So throughout the Cherokee Nation, at this time you see the overhill towns, there's valley towns, middle towns, and lower towns. All of these towns would have been separate. They would have each had their own council house, which was the central structure in each town. The population was about 150 to 600. The decisions would have been made by a consensus, and so each town had its own tribal chief and its own council. And a lot of them, mainly we were disconnected by our language and a clan system, which I'll get into in just a moment. Subsistence lifestyle, the Cherokees had that included hunting and gathering. We were not a nomadic tribe. We farmed. We did a lot of hunting, a lot of gathering. We hunted things like bear, maybe more so when you get up into some of the middle towns. But some of the lower towns, a lot of them had crops and were farmers. And I guess when we switched things over, it didn't completely move it, so I apologize for the slide. But Cherokees, we are a matrilineal society. We have 7 Cherokee clans, and what that means by a matrilineal society is that our clan is determined by the mother's side. So whatever clan, if you have a woman who's a wolf clan, then all of her kids, all of her children, boy and girls, will all be born of that clan. The 7 Cherokee clans are Deer, Wolf, Wild Potato, Paint, Blue, Long Hair, and Bird. And there's a little representation of some of the tribes, or some of the clans. (1540) Hernando de Soto and post-European contact. Cherokee's subsistence lifestyle changes with the introduction of trade goods, including cloth, utensils, guns, etc. Hunting begins to change from one of livelihood to one of profit. And it's really not till about 150 years after De Soto comes through the original Cherokee Territory that we really begin to experience, that trade really begins to impact the Cherokees. Firearms become essential to the Cherokees for both war, hunting, and trade. There are a lot of European settlements that begin to crop up in the Cherokee country. The concept of credit and debt, we had never really had this concept before. It was also illegal for any person to sign any land cession treaties. Execution would have been the punishment. So if there was ever any land cessions that were given up by the Cherokee government, then those would have been made, that decision would have been made by a consensus. The council would have been involved. The women also had a large voice in Cherokee politics traditionally. Between 1721 and 1783, there were over 42 million acres in what would later become South Carolina, Virginia, West Virginia, Tennessee, Kentucky, Georgia, and North Carolina that were ceded through treaty from the Cherokee to the British. And a little bit about the forming of the United States, just to give you a little bit of a background on that. The 13 colonies, the United States emerges from these 13 British colonies. Disputes between Great Britain and the colonies led to the American Revolution, and then July 4th of 1776, delegates from the 13 colonies unanimously issue the Declaration of Independence. The war ends in 1783 with the U.S. winning independence from Great Britain. So what that means is that any lands that we had ceded with the British now become property of the United States. And they're responsible for upholding those treaties with us. The Treaty of Hopewell in 1785, it was the very first treaty that was entered into between the Cherokee and the United States. Among other things, it established an understanding of the tribe's territorial boundaries and noted the right of the Cherokee to punish squatters. So anybody who is illegally coming into Cherokee country at that time were able to punish them or evict them. I'm sure a lot of you have heard the term manifest destiny. Some people don't exactly know what that means, but here's a quote, driven by the doctrine of manifest destiny, the United States embarked on a vigorous expansion across North America throughout the 19th century. This involved displacing native tribes, acquiring new territories, and gradually admitting new states. This photo is by John Gatz. It's called American Progress, and it was done in 1872. And I think it's very telling at what the United States and a lot of these colonists who are coming in, or these settlers who are coming in, what they really thought of when they were thinking about the native tribes. You know, you look at the painting and to the left, there's darkness and there's Indians, and you can see a little bit of buffalo, and then here comes this woman, this light, and here she is bringing progress. You see the railroads, the trains, you see telephone lines, and so here she is to come and civilize us. That's really what they were trying to do, is come and civilize the Indians. A lot of people don't realize that, you know, when you think of the Trail of Tears or you think of Indian removal, most people, first thing you really think of is Andrew Jackson, which obviously he played an instrumental role in that, but Indian removal was not a new thought. And even as far back as Washington, thinking, you know, maybe it was best for the Indian tribes to be removed, but President Thomas Jefferson was the one that really started making this happen with the 1802 Georgia Compact. He signed the compact in 1802, and what this did, it was entered into between the United States and the state of Georgia. Georgia was the very last colony that had been admitted with the United States at that time, during the Revolution. The fourth article of the compact stipulates that the United States shall, at their own expense, extinguish for the use of Georgia as early as the same can be peacefully effected on reasonable terms the Indian title to lands within the forks of the Oconee and Ocmulgee rivers, and that the United States shall, in the same manner, also extinguish the Indian title to all the other lands within the state of Georgia. Georgia was really the ones who wanted the Cherokees out. They were pushing heavily. They were putting a lot of pressure, especially on Andrew Jackson when he comes into his presidency. He really, his platform, a lot of it had been on Indian removal and having the tribes removed out west. A little bit about the early 19th century Cherokees at this time, in the 1800s. This is the first time when it really begins to, we have a real separation of class among the Cherokee citizens. Traditional Cherokees would continue to live close to their family in small dwellings. They would continue that subsistence lifestyle. But some of the more affluent Cherokees would adopt these white ways. They would also start sending their children to schools back east to become educated. And some of them owned slaves, lived in these large plantation-style homes. So if you ever are able to visit places like Georgia, there's the Van House there, which when people realize that it was a Cherokee that lived there, people, are a little surprised sometimes because it's a huge, large, beautiful plantation home, and and he was one of the wealthiest men in the Cherokee Nation. And by the early 1800s, intermarriage between the Cherokees and settlers created a group within the tribe that would be known as the mixed bloods. The political change that's occurring in the Cherokee Nation at this time: there were 11 treaties made between the United States and the Cherokees from 1785 to 1819, and all of these involved cessions of land. The Treaty of Holston in 1791 marked the very first time the tribe was referred to as the Cherokee Nation in a treaty. The United States assigns Indian agents to live among the Cherokee people to improve communication. Now, a lot of these Indian agents who are coming into the territory and living with the Cherokee, some will actually marry into the Cherokee Nation or with some of the citizens, but some of them, their job, I feel, was they were there to try to coerce us out of our land and tell us what was best for us. The Cherokee government moves from an autonomous leadership in each to a national government. So before this, we talk about those little towns that the Cherokees had, each having their own chief. We start moving to more of a centralized government and one principal chief, and that way, the United States government is only having to deal with one person. They're not having to deal with all these little chiefs from all these different little towns and communities. In 1805 and 1806, Doublehead, Black Fox, Pathkiller, Tallanteskee, and Bowles, who were all chiefs of the lower towns, signed land cession treaties. Now, this was not uncommon, as long as there is a consensus made. However, Chief Doublehead signs a land cession that he is going to profit from, and so he's illegally ceding Cherokee land. So what's supposed to happen at that point? It's illegal, so he's going to be executed, marked for execution. And this is where I like to introduce a man by the name of the Ridge. Most people know him as Major Ridge. He was instrumental in the execution of Chief Doublehead. In 1807, there was an order that was issued to kill Chief Doublehead for illegally ceding Cherokee lands. There were 3 Cherokees, the Ridge, James Van, and Alexander Sanders, who went to carry out this execution. And the story goes that they were at a tavern, or they found Doublehead at a tavern, and he was shot, but he was able to escape, and supposedly he leaves this trail of blood, and they do find him, and then they execute him in a barn with an axe. In 1821, Sequoyah and the development of the Cherokee Syllabary. A lot of people are familiar with Sequoyah. He's probably one of our most famous Cherokees. Cherokee literacy rates, after the development of the syllabary, our literacy rates were higher than any of the settlers who lived in the states surrounding us. We established our own constitution in 1827. The syllabary did so much for the Cherokees. It allowed us to create our own newspaper. We were able to create our constitution. People were able to write in Cherokee syllabary and communicate with each other. As I mentioned, it prompts the establishment of the Cherokee Phoenix in 1828, and this is the first bilingual newspaper in the United States. A little bit of a timeline here. 1802, Thomas Jefferson signs the Georgia Compact in support of Indian removal. 1822, New Echota is authorized as the Cherokee Nation capital. Cherokee Constitutional Convention is held in 1827, and then we have our own Cherokee Constitution. A lot of people say that this was what really outraged Georgia and the citizens of Georgia, who were insistent that their state, you've got this sovereign Indian nation that lies within the boundaries of the state of Georgia, and there's gold that's discovered there. So that's really, once you have the establishment of the Constitution, which, we're a nation, and we've got, it speaks volumes when you've got your own Constitution and bylaws and things like that you're adhering to as a nation. And Georgia really wanted our land, and so once gold was discovered, that was kind of the final push to get the Indians out and the Cherokees out of Georgia. In 1827, Andrew Jackson is elected as the 7th president of the United States, and as I mentioned before, he did campaign on Indian removal and having the tribes removed. Cherokee Phoenix is first published in 1828. Elias Boudinot is the editor, and I bring Elias Boudinot up. He is very instrumental in what happens as far as the removal of the Cherokees later on, and we'll get into that. 1828, John Ross is elected principal chief of the Cherokee Nation. He was I believe about an eighth. There's a little bit of different opinions on how much Cherokee he was, but at this time, we have this clan system, and that's all that mattered within the Cherokees, was that you had that clan system. It mattered who your mother was and that you had that clan. So he had his clan, and he was a very well-educated Cherokee as well. 1828, gold is found in Georgia, and then between 1828 and 1830, we call them the Georgia harassment laws, and what they were they were a series of state laws that declared Cherokee tribal sovereignty null and void. They were not going to recognize the Cherokee Nation or any of the laws that we were passing. In 1830, President Andrew Jackson authorizes the Indian Removal Act. So in response to a series of these harassment laws that are being enacted by the state of Georgia against the Cherokees, the tribe brought about the issue before the U.S. Supreme Court in the 1830 case of Cherokee Nation versus Georgia. There's also the 1832 case of Worcester versus Georgia. And the U.S. Supreme Court rules during these cases that Georgia has no jurisdiction in the matter, that Chief Justice John Marshall concurred that the designation of Indian tribes as domestic dependent nations, which is an important precedent for all indigenous tribal governments, even to this day. And people really don't understand sometimes what does it mean to be a domestic dependent nation. Sometimes we will compare it to something like Guam or Puerto Rico or the Virgin Islands. We can't have our own army, and we do depend on the federal government for protection and to an extent on other things, but we are our own sovereign tribal nation. And there's a photo right there of the Honorable John Marshall, who was the fourth Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. Andrew Jackson was elected to the U.S. presidency in 1827, and he was a states' rights advocate. He was well known to the Cherokee. We had many encounters with Andrew Jackson before this. His life in U.S. command had been saved by 500 Cherokee warrior allies in 1814 at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, which was fought against the Red Sticks, which were a group of Upper Creek Muskogee Creeks. He had also, as a major general in the U.S. Army, signed the 1817 treaty that provided for the voluntary removal of the old settlers. And this is a good time to talk about the Western Cherokee Nation, or the old settlers, as we commonly refer to them as. But all these settlers who are moving into the southeastern part of the United States and are encroaching on Cherokee lands, there was a couple of groups of Cherokees that would leave at different times. Some say as late as, or as early as 1790s. But really in the early 1800s, you have a couple thousand Cherokees who begin to remove out west and go to Arkansas, and then also later into Indian Territory. And what they were doing was trying to get away from these settlers who were coming in to the nation. Some of them even go as far down as Texas, even down into Mexico. Within a month of Jackson's election, he signed a law to be effective in 1830, annexing to Georgia all the lands of the Cherokee claimed by that state. So he's saying all the lands that Cherokee Nation is claiming, these are all under the state of Georgia. He had favored Indian removal from its conception as a federal policy, and as president would openly defy the U.S. Supreme Court in its ruling on the legal status of the Cherokee Nation. So when Justice John Marshall makes this decision that the Cherokees are domestic dependent nations, it's often said that Jackson makes the comment that John Marshall had made his decision, now let him enforce it. During this time, today we see this as a president could not openly defy the U.S. Supreme Court like that. But, the United States is very young at this point, and states' rights is a huge issue. And, the U.S. Supreme Court can rule however it wants, but, the job at this time, whose job was it to make sure that these rules are followed, that these laws are followed, and that any decisions made are carried out? It should be the president at this time in Congress that, make sure that these are adhered to, and that wasn't going to happen. The U.S. government submitted a treaty to the Cherokee National Council in 1835. President Jackson sent a letter outlining the treaty terms and urging its approval. In that letter, he says, "My friends, listen to me, therefore, while I tell you that you cannot remain where you are now. Circumstances that cannot be controlled and which are beyond the reach of human laws render it impossible that you can flourish in the midst of a civilized community. You have but one remedy within your reach, and that is to remove to the west and join your countrymen who are already established there. And the sooner you do this, the sooner you will commence your career of improvement and prosperity. The Cherokees cannot flourish in the midst of a civilized community." So we had our own court system, we had our own constitution, we had our own schools. We were far more educated than the settlers and people who were living around us. A lot of those people were sending their children to our schools to be educated, and we brought in some of the best teachers. We had our own newspaper. So yeah, when you read that and you look at his feelings towards the Cherokees, people who had saved his life, you know, it makes a lot of people angry. I know people who won't even carry 20s in their wallet, which I'm sure has anyone heard about the Women on 20s movement that's going on? I'm hoping that happens. And I'm rooting for Wilma Mankiller, who's our former chief. I think who better to represent than, and replace Andrew Jackson than a granddaughter of somebody that Jackson forcibly removed. So the Treaty of New Echota. So in 1835, when that treaty is submitted by the U.S. government, and John Ross, who's a very popular chief, he's not going to agree to that. And when you talk about the Treaty Party and the Ross Party or the National Party today, I mean, even today, Cherokees are divided over it. And even today, I feel like we have these factions of the Treaty Party and the Ross Party. And there's so many of us that are descended from both. But it's, to this day, it's still very, a lot of us get really passionate when we start talking about the Treaty Party or the Ross Party, because the Treaty Party, a lot of people argue that the Treaty Party really did see what was going to happen and that the United States was not going to stop. They were going to continuously push for Cherokee lands. Elias Boudnot, who was the first editor of the Cherokee newspaper, he was against removal of the Cherokee for a very long time, and Major Ridge and John Ross had been good friends. They had agreed with each other on a lot of political matters, and it wasn't until you see the switch that goes off with these guys in about 1832. This is when Elias Boudnot resigns from the Cherokee Phoenix, and he starts publishing and writing about why the Cherokees possibly should remove, and he doesn't think that the U.S. government's going to stop ever. Like, they're not going to stop until they have our lands, so that we should take the best deal possible and go ahead and remove west as a tribe so that we can stay together. Well, John Ross is we've got about 16,000 Cherokees at this time, and no one wants to leave their homelands. And this Treaty of New Echota that is signed in 1835, Major Ridge is quoted as saying that he had just signed his death warrant, because remember, just a couple of decades before, he had helped execute Doublehead for doing the exact same thing. So to me, it speaks volumes that somebody who really knew what was probably going to happen to him, even though he was signing this treaty, it's a lot more complicated than people will, when you really think about it. And so in one of his letters, he talks about how he had always hunted these lands and fished these rivers, and this is the land of his ancestors, and he did not want to remove, but he thought that was the best thing for the Cherokee people. Wadey is also a part of this treaty that is signed, as well as John Ridge, who is the son of Major Ridge. And there was about 20 men, I believe, that signed this treaty. And after they sign this, they have a fairly easy removal, and they go ahead and go out west. And what that treaty did was give Cherokees either 2 years to remove on their own, or they're going to be forced out by by the Georgia Guard is what happens. And you can see it's the, if I can find, it's this, if you see number 36, right there at the north part of Georgia, northeast part of Alabama, right there in the southern part of Tennessee, that number 36 is that final land cession, that December 29th, 1835. And so everybody that had signed this removes out west, and those who had stayed there fought against this treaty. And there was a petition that was signed by approximately 16,000 Cherokees, and it only got ratified in Congress by one vote. And they knew that these were not the elected leaders of the Cherokee people, but they went ahead and ratified it. And so in 1838, when they begin the roundups, the Cherokees are initially forced into stockades. There's a lot of sickness, there's a lot of death that occurs just in the stockades before they even get them on the trail. And so some of these first detachments that leave, these first Cherokees who begin out on the river, there was a lot of death and sickness on that. And so when John Ross saw that there was no way that we would be able to stop this, he decides that, okay, we'll go ahead and remove, let us oversee our own removal. And so that's what happens at that time. And here's a slide of the 13 Cherokee detachments. There was the Hare Conrad, Elijah Hicks, Jesse Bushyhead, John Benge, Siduwaki, Oldfield, Moses Daniel, Suwaluka, James Brown, George Hicks, Richard Taylor, Peter Hildebrand, and John Drew. John Ross was on this last detachment that departed, John Drew's detachment. John Ross lost his wife, Quady, on the removal, and she was buried in Little Rock, Arkansas. And our estimates are about 2,000 to 4,000 people died while being removed, conservative being the 2,000, and then 4,000, maybe some of the higher numbers. You have to take into account that people were still sick when they got into Indian Territory, and there was a lot of deaths that happened after removal as well. And these give some statistics on each detachment. When they departed, some of these people are removed. I mean, it takes them 6 months. There was, drought initially on some of these, but then they say one of the worst winters had hit also at that time. And so just about every person would experience some type of loss within their family. When you look at these numbers and you see how many deaths are occurring, most people will lose a grandmother or a child. Those were typically the casualties of this or the deaths were usually the older people or the young ones. The removal was too hard for them. Does anyone have any questions? I feel like we got started a little bit late, so I'm wanting to make sure I don't go into the next presentation. Sorry, we had some technical difficulties. Does anyone have any questions? I didn't. Actually, are they doing a presentation today? I think she's doing one on the Eastern Band. I think there is an Eastern Band history that's going to take place. But no, those were the Cherokees that a lot of them did accept land reserves, and some of them did flee up to the mountains and would hide out. There's even accounts of people who had removed west ended up in Indian Territory, but then turned around and went back to North Carolina. So, there's various reasons. Well, as I mentioned, some of them would just accept land, and people would not remove for various reasons. If I'm married and have a family and we're settled and I'm able to accept a land reserve, then why not do that? But then you've always got that group who is going to stay and defend and not want to ever be removed. And so, as I mentioned, a couple of them also fled up into the mountains. And then I'm not exactly sure when their federal designation was. I think Roy's researched him a little bit more. Roy's the presentation after me, and he's great on the Cherokee rolls. He's going to talk about Cherokee genealogy, but if you're interested in the different rolls and things like that, because I believe they're off of a 1929 Baker roll, is how the Eastern Band defines their citizenship. And so there was a man by the name of William Holland Thomas who did a lot for them and was able to, oversee the land, I guess is how you would say it, for the Eastern Band initially. And I believe he has descendants. I think I'm not really sure about his history, but I think he married or has descendants. Any other questions? No? Once again, I'm sorry we got started so late because we had issues on I'm trying to get our stuff up and going. All right, well, thank you.